All right, I think we have a number of people join, so let's jump in. So first off, thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate it. I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion. So our webinar today is Early Decisions That Matter. And really what we're going to focus on is for venture-backed startups, what they should know at the very beginning that can have a big impact down the line. And I'm Aaron Perman. I'm a principal at S3 Ventures. We're one of the largest venture firms in Texas, focused on Texas, primarily investing in technology startups. And so, you know, over the years, I've worked with a lot of companies from the seed stage all the way through exit. But unfortunately, I don't usually work with them prior to raising their first round. And so I've just seen a lot of things that companies have done at the beginning before we're involved and how much they can have an impact, you know, all the way through and at the exit. And I'm sure Aaron and Anna have as well. And so that's why we're so excited to share this with you, because I think if through this we can help one founder keep a little more of their hard-earned efforts at the end, it'll be well worth it. So before we get started, just want to talk through some webinar logistics. So this is a Zoom webinar. You know, everyone that's joined, you'll be in listen-only mode. And so if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in the webinar, and we'll be monitoring that during the webinar. And so, you know, if some of the questions are relevant to a topic we're covering, we'll weave them in. Otherwise, we will spend some time at the end ensuring that, you know, hopefully at least some of them get answered. You know, please participate in the polling questions. So you'll see polls throughout. We want to make this as participatory as possible. And then following the webinar, recordings will be emailed to all registrants later this week. So if there's something you didn't catch, you want to see it again, or if you want to share it with a friend, please go ahead and do so. So, you know, what we're going to talk about today, we'll start out just, you know, introducing our two fantastic panelists. And then I'll walk through just, you know, I know with markets changing, you know, probably this is top of mind for some people, just overall fundraising preparation and just a quick VC perspective on the market and things you can do in the current time to optimize your chances of success. And then we'll move into some of the expensive legal pitfalls that you can avoid and that are avoidable, that can have a huge impact later, as well as similarly on tax, some of the things from a tax standpoint that can get you cash. So you know, revenue generator is a little tongue-in-cheek, but can get you cash even if you don't pay taxes. And then some of the other things that can have a really, really big impact when you exit that you can only do early. And then, like I said, we'll spend some time answering questions from the audience. So, you know, again, I mentioned we have some great panelists. And so thank you, Aaron and Anna, for joining us. Aaron is a partner at Egan Nelson, and Anna is a partner at Maxwell Lock & Ritter. And so I'll let them each introduce themselves. Aaron, you want to jump in first?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Aaron, for the intro, and thanks for inviting us to be here. And thanks to everyone who joined. My name is Aaron Barker. I'm a partner and chair of the Emerging Companies Group at Egan Nelson LLP. We are a corporate-focused boutique practice. I work with emerging growth companies through all phases of their life cycle, from formation through financing and ultimately through exits and liquidity events. And we have headquarters in Austin and Dallas, but we have attorneys all over the country, and we work with clients all over the country. Yeah, that's my practice. I'm really happy to be here today.
All right. Well, I will echo Aaron and say thank you, other Aaron, for including us today. And thanks for everybody who was able to join. I'm Anna Steppen. I'm one of the tax partners at Maxwell Lock & Ritter. Been with the firm for almost 15 years now after starting with Ernst & Young in Austin. And our firm as a whole, we offer tax, audit, transaction advisory, IT security and compliance, as well as wealth management and retirement. And we really serve kind of all the types of businesses and organizations that Austin and Central Texas have to offer. We do have clients outside of the area, but you know, our focus remains in Central Texas. Personally, my practice focuses on tax compliance and consulting for businesses and their owners. And my clients tend to be either VC backed or private equity backed most of the time. and frequently have multi-state issues or some kind of foreign ownership or subsidiaries, and work with a variety of different industry groups. So that's a little bit about us and about me, and I guess thank you. We'll get started.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Aaron and Anna. And yeah, let's jump in. But before we jump into the topics, just so that we all know who we're talking with, we have a poll for everybody, just to understand which best describes you. And so the options are startup CEO or founder, CFO or other startup executive, service provider or consultant, investor or other. And so it would be great if, love as much participation as possible if everyone could take the poll that should have popped up in your Zoom screen. And again, it's which best describes you. So we'll give it just a minute to let everyone fill it out. Oh, great. Okay, we have a great mix of folks. It sounds like a lot of startup CEOs and founders, a number of CFOs or startup executives, a number of people that provide services to the community, as well as investors and others. So really good mix today. So before we jump into the full panel, I thought I would just share briefly a little bit around the current environment. I'm sure we've all seen kind of the slowdown from last year. And so, this is some PitchBook data that just shows the number of deals over the last, number of quarters. And I think the key takeaway here is that if you look at Q2 of 22, it's definitely down from the peak of 21, but there's still plenty of capital out there. And so, what I would take away from this is really two things. I think the first thing is just realize this data lags a quarter. And so typically anything showing up in here is really, as Q2 is really a deal that got done in Q1 and got announced in Q2. And so you can kind of look at that and see Q4 of 21, which was the peak. That was really Q3 of 21 that was the peak, and it's just lagging. And so, you can see the downtrend, but given we're still well above kind of historical levels, it just means, great businesses are still raising money, and S3's led multiple seed and Series A investments this year, but just preparation is more important than ever. And so I think that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And so as we kind of think about preparation, at least from my perspective of how you can make your fundraise as efficient, as effective as possible, there's kind of a couple of phases. So one are like, what are the things you do in starting your company? And there are two things, kind of, figuring out the market, your pain, the solution, putting together a founding team. And those are the things that I think people really focus on. And those should be big focuses and really key focuses. But there is this third thing that we're going to talk about today, which is, the corporate setup and structure, things like forming the business, company and IP ownership, accounting, tax, that a lot of times is an afterthought. And there are things in that bucket that, if done right early, can save you gobs of money, but there are things that can't be undone or are really expensive to undo, or have material cash expense to undo later. And so really the goal of this conversation is to focus on that third, often non-prioritized bucket. And it's not expensive to do it right. It just requires a little bit of focus. And so those are kind of the things that you set semi in stone as you get started. And then just from a perspective of what can you do 1 to 2 months prior to initial VC fundraise? Here's what we help a lot of our portfolio companies with, because it's really hard to build the plane while you're flying it. And so if you're thinking about a fundraise, to the extent that you can kind of brush up your strategic positioning, think your marketing, messaging, product marketing, all of those things that help you describe the business first, and make sure that's in order. And hopefully that's already in order because it's helping with customers. If you can then use that to build out the investor deck, which will have other information like financial information and other metrics, but it's really telling your company's story. And then put the data room together, like the financial plan, cap table, any other analysis like revenue by customer, unit economics, before you start having investor conversations, it'll just make your life a whole lot easier. And I think especially with the fundraise market kind of reverting more to historical norms, we're probably going to see less preemptive rounds where a VC comes in out of the blue and says, hey, we want to invest in, where you don't kind of have to go through this process, and more fundraising processes. And so as we get back to this sort of, back to more the reversion to the mean, these are the types of things I would be thinking about, if I were a founder looking at the first fundraise. So all of that said, enough of me talking. Let's get Aaron and Anna going on this topic around how you can do things right early and avoid really expensive legal pitfalls and tax pitfalls and other things that I've seen firsthand over the years. So one other poll before we jump into the discussion, though, just to get a sense of kind of where people are in, especially for the founders, in their journey of starting a company. Just kind of put into the poll how your company's structured. So are you an LLC, a C Corp, a partnership, also proprietorship? Have you not yet formed, and your part of why you wanted to join this was to figure out what you should do up front? And then if this isn't applicable, feel free to just put NA. And again, this is just so we can get an idea of who we're talking to on this stuff, how your company is currently set up. Okay, so of the folks that have companies, the majority are C Corps. We've got a number of LLCs, and we'll talk about what the path will be for y'all if you're going to raise venture money. We got a couple partnerships, and then a few people that are thinking about forming their companies. All right, well, let's jump in. And so I think just to start with, there's a question of what type of company you form, but before you even do that, there's a question of how do you form the business? There's lots of online tools like Zen Business and LegalZoom that offer to form a company, quickly and cheaply. You can go the law firm route. And so maybe, Aaron, just to start with you, what have you seen here? Because obviously clients that work with you are now working, with you as their attorney, but maybe they did it themselves at first. What are your thoughts on this topic of, you're just getting started, you want to save some money, you don't have much of a business yet, doing a DIY formation versus hiring a law firm at that stage?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we engage new clients or new clients engage us, they come to us kind of with all different types of sort of backgrounds and levels of sophistication and how the company's been formed. Obviously, when you're starting a brand new company, you're often sort of paying for things out of pocket. And so there's, a temptation to do it DIY. And like you said, Aaron, there's a lot of good resources out there. I guess, what I would say is I think it's worth, investing in getting it done right by a law firm, not just a law firm, by the way, but a law firm that sort of specializes in this particular space of kind of emerging growth companies that are going to be seeking investment, probably venture capital investment, because it's sort of a unique space and things need to be set up a particular way. And, I'm a big believer, too, that when it comes time for diligence, when investors want to look at your legal file and, or venture capital groups, have their counsel start looking through your legal file, if it's done correctly, and not only correctly, but everything looks like what they would expect it to look like, because, again, this particular space has its own kind of requirements and also just sort of norms. And so when you go through that diligence process, if it looks right, you build credibility. Even if your documents are sort of technically right, but they don't look like what people might expect to see, then I think you lose credibility. Then I think that it causes whoever's conducting the diligence to do more, to question your file more, and it's not sort of a check the box exercise like it could be if everything's kind of neat and tidy the way a good experienced law firm would do it. That's one aspect of it. And of course, the other part is, like everything in life, doing it right the first time is far cheaper than trying to correct it down the road. And I think that's absolutely true of new company formation, as it is for almost everything else. And so, even if, there is this possibility that some people might DIY formation their company and do it kind of more or less correctly. And that's great, but there's also a lot of kind of ways that it can be done incorrectly that hardly anything is going to be fatal. A good lawyer can find ways to sort of correct, early mistakes, but it's usually more costly, more time consuming. The formation of your business is kind of like the foundation of your house. If everything you build on top of it, it depends on that foundation. And, you can fix a foundation if it's cracked, but it's never going to be quite as solid as if it was done correctly the first time. So, I think most, law firms in this space offer kind of fixed fee formation packages that tend to run sort of $3,000 to $5,000, which I know when you're paying for everything out of pocket because you don't have any funding yet is a lot of money, but I think it's money well spent and a good investment. I think it'll not only save you a lot of headaches down the road, but also help you raise money, establish credibility with investors.
Yeah, and I would just, one perspective from like my perspective, even a seed fundraise, you can expect that the legal bill on each side of the table is probably going to be $10,000 to $15,000. And that's if everything's done right. I'll say that I don't think I've ever seen an instance where someone did a DIY formation on LegalZoom or similar that didn't need significant revisions. And if there's a lot of revisions, those revisions can easily cost another $10,000 or more at the time of the fundraise. And so that's just my perspective. I'm sure someone has done it, and maybe it's not that it's technically wrong, but just usually they require quite a bit of rework to get them to the point where an institutional investor is comfortable. I think there's a question from one of the audience on what would Aaron, what would you look for in a law firm that specializes in new company setup?
I would recommend you look for, attorneys that have a long track record of, practice in this space, because, there's a lot of sort of small firms and solo practitioners who kind of do general business, but they may not have, an attorney who's helping folks set up bars and restaurants is different from an attorney who's helping folks set up high growth companies. And so I think, frankly, the reality is that the big firms, especially big firms that are sort of West Coast, Silicon Valley, have sort of set the standard for how these things are formed. And so, you could work with a large firm, but they're often cost prohibitive for first time, for entrepreneurs who are, again, funding things out of pocket. So I think, ideally, perhaps if you find an attorney who comes from that type of background and has that training, but is working in a different setting, and, not to just plug my own firm, but at Egan Nelson, that's part of our value proposition, is that we're attorneys who were trained in that kind of large firm environment, but are now practicing in this, more affordable boutique setting. So I just think it really boils down to finding an attorney who has a lot of experience with these specific types of companies, because it is a unique area, and the way you form, a new consulting group or a new, like I said, bar or restaurant is very different from the way you would form a new kind of emerging growth company. So it really just boils down to the experience of the attorney.
Yeah, I say, speaking of that, that's a good dovetail into this LLC versus C Corp. This is something that we see a lot with early stage companies that they'll kind of think it's really easy to get going as an LLC. The flip side of that is, I'll just say from the VC perspective, pretty much every venture firm will require the company convert to a Delaware C Corp concurrent to investment for a whole host of reasons. But I won't spend too much time talking about that. Rather, I think maybe Aaron, if you want to start with some thoughts, and then Anna maybe jump in after that from the tax perspective on this. I think that would be great. So Aaron, maybe start us off on this topic.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll be a little brief, because I think a lot of this is tax driven, and Anna was going to have the most insight here. But I will say that we do often counsel entrepreneurs to strongly consider the C Corp, largely for the reason that Aaron just mentioned, which is that there are many investors out there, especially funds and professional investors, who will require a Delaware C Corp. So if you're not set up that way, you'll have to convert to that prior to closing, and that it's more expensive to convert than it would have been to set it up correctly or as a C Corp the first time. And the other thing is, there are some other kind of benefits around the C Corp, just around sort of accounting and administration. Equity compensation for employees is generally is easier to do and more standardized through a C Corp. But there are some tax benefits to the LLC, so I don't want to make it sound like it's sort of an easy decision and you always choose C Corp. So maybe Anna can help think through some of that.
Yep. I will say, in the whole world of income tax, the C Corp versus LLC pass-through has a lot of considerations. Amongst our client base, a lot of people like the pass-through because the big thing with C Corps is double taxation. You get hit with tax twice. However, today we're really talking about, the VC funded and pre-VC funded space. And so generally those companies are not yet making profits, nor are they pulling dividends. So the LLC, which is the pass-through, to me in this particular space, the main benefit that it provides is if you're a founder and you're bootstrapping, these are your dollars and you're funding it, the LLC form lets you utilize those tax losses on your tax return as you go. And it's kind of, you can use losses to the extent that you have skin in the game. There are some other limitations, but that's really the one big upside in this specific space. And then the C Corp has, I think, some pretty key benefits. So like Aaron said, when it comes to equity incentives, which are extremely common, the C Corp form is it's more simple, and people understand options and they understand holding stock. When it comes to owning an LLC and getting a K-1 and waiting to file their return, it can create some complexity that people don't necessarily want to deal with. And then the really big thing, and I know we'll talk about this more later, is C Corp form is what is required if you are going to potentially qualify for the Section 1202 qualified small business stock, which can be just a huge benefit. And I understand is, the main reason VCs want this form. And so you have to be in C Corp form to have that benefit. And you can do that from an LLC conversion, but once you own it as a C Corp, that's starting your clock. So I think the poll suggested too, the most of the founders here are operating in C Corp form. And in this environment, I think that often makes a lot of sense.
Hey, dig into that a little more. Dig into the QSBS topic. Like, what, just very high level, what is that? What do you need to do to get it, and why is it so meaningful?
Okay. We'll start with why it's so meaningful, because then people might listen to the other details, So this if you can get this benefit, it's Section 1202, we call it, or QSBS. It allows for potentially enormous taxable gains to avoid tax entirely. Kind of up to $10 million or 10 times basis, you can sell and not owe tax on your gain. So that's huge. And I kind of think of it in two buckets. So what does the company have to be and do? And then what does the investor have to be and do? And so the company, it has to be a domestic C corporation. So that's a Delaware form. It doesn't have to be Delaware form, though they usually are. C corporation, it has to be in a qualifying trade or business. And so that's a lot of them, but there are a list of things that don't count. The health accounting law, banking and insurance, hospitality, farming, there are some more, but there are some businesses that won't qualify. And then, from a policy perspective, the reason for this is to incentivize people to invest in early stage. It's not so much to incentivize people to cash out founders. And so you can't have significant redemption transaction in this window sort of before and after the stock issuance. That can disqualify you. So it is quite complex. So this is a place where we'd say, use professional advice, but that's the big picture on the company. And then for the individual or for the taxpayer, it does have to be an individual, can be owned through a pass-through, which is quite common, with VC funds. And then you have to hold it for 5 years. And that's the really big point. And that's why we talked about starting the clock. So you have to have held your stock for 5 years prior to your exit event to be able to get this benefit. And then you also, the other big thing is you have to get it through an original issuance. So, you got the stock from the company. That can also work with the conversion. So the LLC to C Corp can work, but it can't be a secondary purchase. I can't go buy stock from Aaron and have that qualify as QSBS stock for me. So those are the biggies. And, the clock thing is a big issue. And I know we've all seen, I think you guys have seen times when people just miss the boat. I've got a client now who's, several years down the road in pass-through form and thinking, wow, I really like the idea of that qualified small business stock idea, but I don't think I want to hold for 5 more years. And so there's this issue, the timing issue can be significant.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen a couple heartbreaking things where, really, and just at the highest level, if we look at like our portfolio and most startups, I would say probably 95% of technology startups qualify, and really pretty much all SaaS startups generally are in a qualifying category, and that's most of our portfolio. And so the key is you have to be a qualifying business, which most SaaS startups are, and hold that stock for 5 years from the date you got it, and the date starts at the time the C Corp was formed. So either at formation or when you convert from an LLC to a C Corp. And, we've had instances like where a company was an LLC for the first 5 years of their life and then converted to a C Corp when we invested, and the company sold 4.5 years later. And in that instance, because it was under the 5 years, the founder paid, 20% long-term capital gains when they could have paid 0 taxes on the gains. And we had another instance where a company raised a Series B and the founder sold just a little bit in a secondary to get some liquidity. And again, it was an LLC conversion, and he paid capital gains tax on it when if they had started as a C Corp, he wouldn't have had to do that. And so, it's just, it can be quite material. And I think I see a question about convertible note conversions. Really totally fine, but it starts the day you actually get the equity, not the day that you invested in the note. And Aaron, I think you've probably seen this. What can be the cash cost for a founder, like when they convert from an LLC to C Corp? Like, can they have to come out of pocket and write a check at that time?
There are scenarios where the conversion can create tax liability. It sort of depends on what the situation is with the LLC prior to the conversion. I think Anna is probably the best person to speak on that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we've seen some unpleasant, tax surprises or tax consequences when in connection with conversions.
Yeah. So there are a few others, but the main one I think that comes up is if upon conversion, the entity is transferring in debt that exceeds the asset basis. So you can have a gain there. And that generally happens because you've taken losses prior in the LLC form, that owners have taken losses, and then they become, no longer on the hook for some of the funding of that. And so it can flip then and create a taxable gain event for them.
And Anna, just to clarify, that's taxable event for the founder, not necessarily, it's not the company that is on the hook, it's the founder themselves are hit with that.
Yeah, we've seen instances where companies converted from LLC to C Corp, and founders have had to come out of pocket personally for high 5 or even six figure checks, basically repaying the losses, the taxable losses they had taken over like a 5-year period at the time of the conversion. And so, especially if you are planning to raise venture money, there can be, you can almost, you may think of it where you're getting the losses early, but you may have to just pay those back all in one chunk when the money comes in, or a lot of those. So just things to think about. And you should go get professional advice if you're in that bucket, not just rely on this webinar. So what about if you have co-founders? What are some of the things that and these are things that I think, to Aaron's point, a lot of this stuff is fixable. These are things that are, I think, less fixable if you don't set them up right. What are some best practices on setting up a company with co-founders and handling equity?
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of issues between co-founders. It tends to be one of the most kind of difficult and costly kind of early stage hurdles that companies go through. It's sadly just kind of more common than you might think for co-founders to kind of have differences of opinion, or for a co-founder to decide that they don't want to do the startup after all. And so obviously kind of first and foremost is vesting. I think a lot of times founders think of vesting as something that the stock that they receive when they form their company can be subject to a vesting schedule such that if they leave the company before a certain time, the company can reclaim, repurchase the stock. And so the founder, the person who left leaves with less or perhaps none of the stock. And so I think a lot of times founders think of vesting as something that investors will ask them to do. It's like an investor protection that, when they do their Series A or whatever, they'll negotiate with the investors to decide on a vesting schedule. But that's not entirely true, because it also protects the founders as amongst one another. So if you do have that situation where one of your co-founders decides that they don't want to, do this venture after all, or there's a disagreement and somebody decides to leave, they don't walk away with a huge chunk of your business, because otherwise, if there is no vesting schedule, then anybody who leaves keeps the stock that they had. And if you have a significant co-founder, or 50% co-founder, or even 20% co-founder, and they leave with that big chunk of your company, but they're not going to be contributing anything going forward, that's a big problem. And, if they have a specific role, like a technical role or something like that, for instance, you probably will need to hire their replacement. And part of hiring their replacement would be equity compensation, typically, for a startup. So, you want the equity back from the person who left so that you don't dilute yourself too much when you hire the replacement. So I think, probably the biggest thing to think through is vesting, and to think of vesting not as just something that's sort of being pushed on you by investors, but something that actually protects you as a co-founder. And then I see the other kind of point on the slide here is IP ownership, which again, that's also critical, because it's absolutely critical that when you form your company, the intellectual property, proprietary information agreements are put in place then, so that if a founder, leaves or, for whatever reason, they don't, walk away with a claim on the company's IP. Also, if you don't take care of IP ownership in connection with the formation of the company, and you decide to do it later, like let's say a venture capital group notices that you haven't done it correctly and asks you to fix it, it's harder down the road, because you typically will have to come up with some sort of consideration to give to the person who's giving over the IP rights. Whereas if you did it at the formation, you don't need a separate consideration typically. So, getting it right the first time, both vesting and IP ownership, can save you a lot of headaches down the road if something should happen that, causes the co-founder group to split or change.
And by the way, that the absolute worst time to have to deal with this is at like 3 a.m, 2 days before you're trying to sell a company. And I can just tell you from personal experience, working with a lot of our companies in that process, that most acquirers of technology companies will not buy your company if every employee since inception, at a minimum, every R&D and product employee has not signed an agreement saying the company owns the IP, and same with any like technology consultant you've used. And when you're 2 days before selling a business, you can find yourself in the position of having to chase down one line level engineer that worked at a company 5 or 6 years ago, and basically begging them to sign something. The whole deal is kind of held at hostage if you can't get that agreement signed. So, I just to emphasize what Aaron said, like it just gets harder the longer and further and more valuable the business is. And so starting this early is a really important thing to do.
Yeah, that's right. I'll just say quickly that everything we do at every stage of the business is designed, ultimately with the exit in mind. And so that's exactly what Aaron was talking about. Another thing, though, is that when you raise money, you're probably going to be asked to represent to the investors that every service provider you've ever used, employee, consultant, advisor, has signed a proprietary information agreement that provides that, the intellectual property they generate when providing services for the company belongs to the company. And so if there's someone that didn't sign, maybe you had a co-founder who sort of came and went quickly before you got it figured out, you'll have to disclose the fact that there was somebody who didn't sign. You will need to disclose that to the investors. Of course, they're going to have questions. You're going to have to explain that. And they may even ask you to go out and get the agreement signed with the person before they'll, invest in your company. As Aaron said, that can be tricky, especially perhaps if the split wasn't amicable. I've seen situations where co-founders don't want to reach out to the old co-founder. And then, you might have to pay some sort of consideration to make the IP assignment or proprietary information assignment valid. So they're just, yes, if it's not done correctly at formation, it can be a huge source of trouble down the road, and it will be surfaced because you'll be asked to represent to the investors that it's been done correctly.
There's a great question in the chat about this. One's near and dear to my heart. Is what about contractors hired on, say, Upwork? Do they need to sign? Not QA, right? Anyone who wrote code. So absolutely, QA needs to sign. Really, you should have every single employee sign. Some buyers want even your inside salespeople to have signed one. That's ideal. When push comes to shove, like maybe they'll accept a junior inside salesperson that was there for 6 months not signing one. But absolutely, anyone that's touched anything around your product, whether it's QA, written code, product management, like absolutely needs to sign. And so the one saving grace is some of the online platforms, like especially designers, if you use designers off Upwork, they need to sign. But some of these online platforms, they have like click wrap agreements that basically assign you the IP ownership. So maybe it's not the company's form, but hopefully the better ones have something integrated where something that says it's work for hire and you own the ultimate product of the work, assuming you pay. So for instance, like 99 Designs has that if you ever use that for a logo. And so I would say like general best practices to have them sign your form, but at a minimum, ensure whatever freelancer marketplace you're using has something that specifically says the company owns a work product and and make sure you make a copy of that because that'll need to go in your data room. There's a question here about, there's a whole bunch of questions around founder vesting. Why don't we hold some of these till the end? There's one question though, that's a quick one, Aaron, about the best place to get an agreement template. What's a good place to do that for like an EPIA?
Yeah, I think you have to be, it's a little tricky because sometimes state law can influence what the proprietary information agreement should say. So you have to be a little careful that if you're hiring someone in California, it might have different language than if you're doing it in Texas. So it's hard to just say, oh, here's the place to go to get the template. I believe Y Combinator has some forms that they make available that are good, but again, might not be appropriate for every situation. So, I hate to just kind of, I understand that the DIY, the desire to do it that way, but I would say, it's kind of one of those things you should probably talk to counsel about, and counsel who's, familiar with these issues. Because getting it wrong is the risk of getting it wrong is pretty severe. The consequences can be severe. So, so I guess sadly, I don't know of a repository online with free templates that I can sort of like wholeheartedly recommend.
Great. All right. I'll make sure we get to the fun with taxes. But one more quick topic here is around founder capital. So if you're a founder and you're just getting started and you're self-funded, like how do you actually put the money into the company? What do you get for it?
Yeah. So, there's different ways to think about that, and some of it is tax driven. So I want to get honest thoughts on this for sure. There's sometimes we see founders who do a founder note and we're happy to help founders with that, where they're, essentially lending money to the company. But the question is what happens to that note? I think you should be prepared as a founder, and Aaron, actually, you might have thoughts on this, but I think you should be prepared as a founder that when you raise money, investors are generally not going to want that money to be used to pay back the founder for startup costs. Investors want their money to fuel the future growth of the company, not pay for past debts. So, I sometimes talk to founders who have the idea that, oh, well, I'm putting all this money in, but as soon as we raise our Series A, I'll just pay myself back. And that's typically not as easy as it may sound. You can also just say that the money you're putting into your business is a contribution to the capital of the business. And here's where I want to get honest thoughts, because this is kind of a tax issue. And that will ultimately lead to some tax benefits for you, when you sell the equity. But broadly, I think those are kind of the two approaches we see, where it's either there's going to be some sort of promissory note, maybe a convertible promissory note that will convert into stock, or just a contribution to capital that will have some positive tax impacts down the road.
Yeah. So I think, if you are just doing cash in for stock right away, that gets us back to the qualified small business stock. You've started the clock right then, which I think is a good thing. on the other hand, and I was going to say, if you feel like maybe you would like to pull some cash back pretty quickly, the debt option can be nice because you've already set it up with some interest and some repayment terms, but I guess that may or may not work out depending on what the investor is open to. And then just one other point I'd make, if you happen to be in LLC format for some early, year or two, because you're wanting to be able to utilize the losses on your tax return, you need something that gives you skin in the game. So that can be capital contributed. It can also be debt. It can also be debt that you guarantee, but you can't use tax losses for yourself if you're not on the hook for the money. So if it's just bank debt, that's not going to let you use tax losses. So those are my thoughts on that one.
Yeah, super helpful, Jan. And good point on the note. I would say generally investors, do want the capital fueling the business. I think so. It's unlikely if you put lots of capital in your initial investment. Say, hey, we're going to put $1 million in and then use half of it to pay back that note. There are always exceptions. If there was like you needed to make one payroll while the legals happen and close around, and it's $25,000 or $30,000, that's usually kind of like a non-issue. But we've definitely seen, some folks sometimes put capital in a convertible note that converts into the round alongside the investor, and that can be a really smart thing to do. And it can definitely be a deal negotiation point, but it at least sets you up from a position of strength as you think about that. So those are just some of the different considerations. So let's turn our attention to tax and accounting and how it can make you some money. But again, just so we understand where everybody is, we got one more poll. And so primarily targeted at the founders or startup execs about how much money you raised to date. And so we got some just high level ranges here. Would love to get kind of just participation on this. And again, the question is how much money you've raised to date, including equity and debt, so like convertible debt or bank debt or any other types of funding. And so we'll just give it a minute for people to participate. We'll wait another few seconds here. All right. Okay. So lots of early stage companies that are in that 0 to 1 million, 1 to 5 million, and then a few folks a little further down the path that hopefully at that point have done everything as we have talked about it here, and their company structure is in great shape. All right, so a few things to talk about on the tax side. Some that actually can get you dollars for the government, even if you're losing money, although there's now a new asterisk that recently got passed, and then a few other things that can have real big tax consequences that like you can't fix after the fact, so you have to do it right the first time in a limited time period. But before we jump into those, Anna, talk to us a little bit about R&D tax credits and then some of these other implications that have emerged recently.
Sure. I think the title feels a little aspirational in many cases, trying not to lose too much to taxes versus generating, but the R&D credit is an exception. And so for a lot, we've had the R&D credit for many, many years. And for most of those, it wasn't that big of a help for early stage companies because it is generally an income tax credit. And if you're not paying income taxes, it just wasn't helping you. But we had a law change a few years back. And so from 2016, we've had this payroll tax offset option. And so that's for eligible small businesses, which generally means, you're in your first 5 years of revenue and you're not exceeding revenue of 5 million a year. So, so that's a lot of early stage companies. And so they have the option to compute the credit, which ballpark can be about 10% of your qualifying spend. Largely that's your wages, also contract, also supplies. And then you can, instead of claiming that as an income tax credit, you can claim it as a payroll tax offset. So offsetting the employer side of the payroll taxes. The limit has been $250,000 per year, which if you kind of back into payroll taxes, that equates to a pretty big payroll. So sometimes you don't get it all at once, but you might carry it forward. And then we actually, with the Inflation Reduction Act that just passed last month, they upped that annual limit to 500,000. So that's a pretty cool thing. And there's a downside, which Aaron mentioned. So as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act about 5 years ago, we got this law that honestly, I think myself and most practitioners thought would have been done away with prior to now, but it hasn't been. So beginning this year, 2022, companies are required to capitalize their R&D costs and amortize over 5 years or 15 years if it happens to be R&D that you're incurring in a foreign country. And so that's a huge change. And that's regardless of whether you're claiming a credit. So I feel like this is a thing that was a budget tool and not grounded in policy whatsoever. You know, I'm still hoping that this gets fixed eventually, but that's where we are now. So it's important for people to be aware.
That's super helpful. We got one question in the chat on the R&D tax credits you mentioned. Like, if you take those tax credits, does it impact your taxable income? So if you were a loss making, take a tax credit, does that credit count as income?
It doesn't count as income, but there is a little nuance. So if you claim a credit, you have to then reduce your deductions by the amount of the credit. And there is an election you can make to not do that and take a reduced credit. So we could quickly get into the weeds here, yeah. But there's a little, planning around that. If you're big in net operating losses and you've got a lot of people on payroll, you'll probably want to take the full credit, take a little offset to your deductions, doesn't matter, and then use that credit as an offset to your payroll tax. But yes, there are some nuances to it.
Well, one other in the weeds, but I think this is a quick one on the capitalization of R&D. Does that apply to cash basis filers? This was another question from the chat.
Yeah, it's not. This isn't a cash or accrual issue. And again, I frankly can't justify it in any good policy because we're on the other hand incentivizing R&D in so many ways. So we may not get it fixed this year, but I'm holding out hope that this eventually gets fixed.
Yeah, super helpful. What about, so we got this 83B elections. That sounds scary and complicated and boring and in the weeds too, but like, at least from my perspective, this can really matter. Talk to us about like what that is and why everybody on this call should care about something that sounds so technical, tax codey.
Yeah. So the general idea, if you get equity of kind of all different types or property generally, is that you're taxed on it when you fully received it. So that would be as the vesting transpires, or sometimes there are other restrictions that lapse. That's the general way that it works. The 83B election says, hey, yeah, I may not have to be taxed on it for the next 4 years, but I'd like to be taxed on it now. And the reason that you do that is because now the value is probably very low. It might even be close to zero. Whereas we hope that in 2, 3, 4 years, the value is quite a bit higher. So the 83B election is utilized when you've got vesting or other restrictions and you want to be taxed on it. Now it can also, help with that 1202 5-year clock. So it can be useful in a lot of ways. And it's on the screen, which is good. The thing that's really, really important is it has to be done within 30 days of receiving the grant. And there are not exceptions or extensions to that. It is 30 days. So usually, I think Aaron would probably say, that paperwork is right there with your equity incentive grant. It's like the next page, hopefully right behind it. And you file that with the IRS, and then we usually attach it to the tax return for the year as well.
Yeah, no, Anna, that's exactly right. When we work with companies that are issuing stocks subject to vesting schedules, we include the 83B form and instructions about how to file the form and all that. It's a personal tax filing, so most law firms probably won't make it on your behalf, but they'll give you everything you need to make it.
Yeah, and I think there's one tiny downside, which, because this sounds great and wonderful and we should always do it, and probably the vast majority of the time it is, you do have some downside risk if it so happens that the stock value drops as you vest, then you can, you couldn't have been taxed on a higher value than what you ultimately end up getting. So we don't like to think about those things, but I'm just saying it may be something that you do 95% of the time, but there are occasions where it may not make sense.
Yeah, and just to echo, you have exactly 30 days from when it was granted, not your vesting commencement date.
Right.
So if the board granted you on, 9/1 and didn't tell you about it till 9/10, you still only have till 9/30 to file, and you go over by 1 day and it doesn't count and there's nothing you can do to ever fix it. And so to Anna's point and Aaron's point, like, if you don't file this, your date for short-term versus long-term capital gains starts as each tranche of stock vests. If you don't file this, your date, the 5-year date for QSBS to pay no capital gains taxes, doesn't start when you're granted. It starts from each time the stock vests, and invests over 4 years. Your last tranche might not start on the clock for long-term, capital gains or QSBS till 4 years from now. Two quick questions in the chat. So one is, can you file an 83B election for ISO and NSO stocks? So I think that probably means for stock options.
Yeah, so the 83B election isn't for when you receive a grant of an option, because it's all about when you receive property and an option is not property, but these do come into play when you exercise. So that would, when you exercise, and often there's still a vesting period, that would be the time that you would use the 83B election in an option setting.
So really is if you exercise an option that's fully vested, you're saying you wouldn't need an 83, but if you exercise an option early as it's still vesting, that's when you would file. Is that right?
Yeah.
Got it. And so go ahead.
I was just going to chime in and say that's one reason why companies should think hard about whether to issue early exercise options, at least outside of, certain specific negotiated situations, because, you're creating a situation where the people you issue the options to could be exercising, failing to file the 83Bs. That can have consequences, obviously negative consequences for the individual, but there's also some issues that the company might face. So in general, early exercise options should be, in my view, kind of reserved for situations where sort of unique and perhaps negotiated situations, as opposed to just sort of your default type of option.
And then one other thing, there's a question in the chat on if someone's equity in the company isn't vesting as a founder, do they need to do an 83B election?
I mean, no, if you're fully vested, then then your tax event has already happened. And so the 83B election is really about accelerating your tax event. And I think, sometimes when there's a conversion or a new investor that comes in, you can get vesting put back on you, even if you were previously vested. In that scenario, you probably do want to file an 83B, but if you have no vesting situation, then the 83 or other, we talk about vesting, but sometimes there are other restrictions, anything that keeps you from having full rights, to have it, own it, sell it, do what you want. That's where the 83B comes into play.
What about just stock options in general? For any employee that has stock options, what are considerations they should think about when it comes to should they exercise vested options even if they're still at the company? Should they not? What's some just really high level tax planning that employees could do that could affect potentially save them tons of money at an exit?
I mean, I think the biggest thing in the corporate setting is incentive stock options. So that's specifically named in your plan and it's a specific legal term, but those can offer some big tax benefits. So if the employee is granted incentive stock options, there's no tax at the grant, and then they can exercise and there's no tax event there, generally no tax event. And then when they sell it down the road, if they've met all the requirements, all that upside is long-term capital gain. So that's a pretty nice, this is effectively compensation for you being there and working hard, and you have a chance to get a whole lot of it at long-term capital gain rate. And the big thing on that for employees to know is that you have to, before you sell, you have to have held the stock for 2 years from your grant date and 1 year from your exercise date. Those are the kind of key things for employees to be aware of. And if you don't, want to put the cash out, or you want to kind of sit and wait and see what happens, and is there going to be a big sale, you can, and then you don't risk your cash, but you're going to miss out on that long-term capital gain rate. If you exercise, the day that the company sells, then you're not getting long-term capital gains. So.
And when you say that, what's that? They say Tom after held it for a year, or hold the stock for a year and 2 years from the grant date. When you say holding the stock, is that the date that you granted the option, or is that the date you exercise the stock?
Right, that's from the exercise. So you're owning the option isn't it? It's owning the actual stock. And so again, and that's where we talked about 83B. If you exercise, but there's still some more vesting period, your holding date starts when your vesting lapses, unless you do the 83B. The 83B kind of says, for all income tax purposes, this is mine now. I'll pay tax on it now if need be, and I own it from now.
Yeah, we definitely see some scenarios where, execs at portfolio companies, have been there for 5-7 years, didn't write the check to exercise their options. And so they were fully vested for a number of years, and the company sells, and all of their consideration, sometimes millions of dollars of consideration, they end up paying just standard short-term personal income tax rates on. And to make matters worse, usually option consideration for options that are not exercised ends up getting paid through payroll. Yep. So they have payroll taxes taken out as well, where, if they had exercised their options, or maybe their lowest strike price option, so the cheapest one to exercise, they got really early, a year before that, they would have paid half the taxes on that. And if they had exercised those, if they've been there for a decade and exercised those 5+ years ago, they might have paid no taxes on it and got in QSBS. And so I've seen this add up to hundreds of thousands, or, in one case, probably almost $1 million, in big exits. And I mean, you're talking about a tragedy of riches, right? Because these are, the better the outcome, the more it is, but it's just something to think about, relative to the risk of putting that capital at risk. So I know we're running short on time. Let's just quickly hit the bottom line. Anna, what are some of the quick thoughts on how can someone spend a few extra hours in the beginning to save lots of professional services fees and headaches as they grow and they just set things up on accounting and tax?
Yep. So I'm more in the tax world, not the bookkeeping or accounting, but I will say, you've got to do this from the start. We see a lot of QuickBooks, but other software packages can work as well. I think frequently early stage companies go and get, a consultant or contractor, some sort of outsourced CFO service, which I think can be great because you can get high level expertise and experience for a little bit of time, at a relatively little cost when you're not ready to, to hire a heavy hitter full time. And then on the tax side, I will say we often, start doing the tax work right before or right after the first VC round. And, I can't say that there's a ton of excitement or risk in your income taxes specifically in the very early years. I think the issues are more around all these equity things we talked about, right? I might slap your NOL tax return out there and it's not that exciting, but you're going to have a lot of questions about the equity stuff, and that's where it's helpful. And just, making sure you get that R&D payroll tax credit. So it's those things. It's not your income tax per se, but it's the other stuff that we've hit on today that I think an advisor can really provide value with.
Yeah, and I'll say from the investor standpoint, spending a few hours with that advisor, whether it's like a part-time CFO or bookkeeper up front, helping them understand your business so that they can set up all your different categories in QuickBooks the same way that you think about and forecast things. It will just save you hours and hours of rework down the road. And so just a little preparation really will make everything from investor diligence easier. It will potentially save you money on your tax filings because your books will be clean versus a mess that the Anna or someone on your staff has to spend lots of hours digging through. So I know we're kind of at time here. We're sort of I think we're a minute over actually, and we got through a lot of the questions but not all of them. So I don't know if we're going to have time to hit all of them now. Just looking at these, there is one question. These are probably quick ones. On the QSBS, you had mentioned it had to be an individual. What about a trust? Does a trust count?
Yeah, so I more accurately would have said a non-corporate taxpayer. So
great. And then one other thing, there's a question about should a vesting schedule be put in place for companies with a sole founder? What, Aaron, Anna, do you guys have thoughts on that?
I'll just say that, obviously you don't have the issue around your co-founder leaving you and keeping a bunch of equity, so you could not have a vesting schedule. There is some strategic thinking around perhaps putting one in place so that when you raise money, you won't be asked to put one in place then by the investor, because the investor will probably want one if you don't have one. And they may want to start the vesting clock when they close their investment, whereas if you had one in place previously, you might get credit for what you've already vested.
Yeah, that's a great point. Maybe just say good enough. Don't want to open that Pandora's box. And one other thing, the employer retention tax credit. Anna, do you think that's going to be extended?
No, it was already cut from all 4 quarters of 2021 to just 3 quarters. So people are still claiming it, I will say. Going back and amending payroll tax returns to claim it. But I mean, barring another disaster that I don't want to think about, I don't expect that to be extended, as far as further dates of applicability.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. I just want to first off say thank you to Aaron and Anna for this great conversation and for joining me today. And thanks again for everyone on this webinar who's joined and participated. And just a little plug from us, we have this S3 Ventures Startup Toolkit on our website, s3vc.com/s3-resources, that has a whole bunch of helpful, hopefully helpful tools for early stage companies, whether it's modeling out a capitalization table so you can think through what things will look like over multiple rounds of funding, an option grant workbook, which puts some of the stuff we talked about around vesting into practice for employee option holders, and then different operating model templates for different types of businesses that can help you think through setting up kind of some of the finance accounting planning. So appreciate you all joining us, and just thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.